Hello, welcome to the channel and thanks for watching, and in this video I'm showing you how I made an extra trailer for my cargo weight ridge hauler for ash wastes, made up of cast up parts, some spares from the other kits, some spares from completely different kits. So the idea for doing this came to me quite a few months ago when they announced ash wastes. I've always wanted to do some kind of bug hunting, kind of harpoon type thing. There's an ideal weapon on the night kit which I bought and converted up from a death guard, so if you're interested in 40k as well you could check that out. And it was really on my mind when buying these kits. Now the brilliant thing is, with the ridge haul you can build it in 6 or 8 wheel format. So I bought a ridge haul and a trailer, that was in last week's video if you want to check that out, and saved the wheels from each of those kits. So 2 wheels from the actual hauler, 2 wheels from the trailer that I bought. Built them up, and now we're going to expand that into an actual trailer. So you can see the first stage here is really testing where they're going to go, working out the direction of travel that these things are going to go in, and working out the spacing. So I've just used a couple of little bits of sprue, cut up and stuck in between the wheels to expand them out to the right kind of length to make the trailer kind of really look the right size. What I'm holding here is a cast up part of one of the mud guards. We'll come back onto that in a second, just to get the spacing on the wheels correctly. Now I've glued them together, stacked them on end so that they set into a straight line. Now I'm working out the deck. Now this is a spare part again from the trailer. When you build the trailers you can keep this panel spare if you're going to put one of the Munitorum armoured containers in. So I did, specifically really to get hold of these spares. Now it's cutting it down to size. I try to be sort of accurate when I'm doing this, but you know, I'm more about sort of speed and getting it bashed out, and especially with Necromunda, if it looks a little bit scrappy, that's absolutely fine because that's kind of the nature of the background of Necromunda. But you don't want it too messy, and if you do make a bit of a mess, I'll show you how to touch things up in a second. So I'm cutting these down to the 2 sides because I want the 2 kind of circular areas. If you look at the ridge hauler, the actual trailers and things as well, these circular patches are what the wheels are built up around, and also how you mount the armoured container in there. They line up with the kind of entry hatches to the armoured container, and I want to use these circles in kind of the same way. So I wanted to cut it down like that. I think it'll work quite nicely. Now when you've cut it down though, just sticking together along the seam won't really hold together, it won't give enough structural strength. So what I've done there is, once I finish cleaning it up, just again cut down some little bits of sprue and mount them underneath these 2 panels to kind of bolster them together a little bit. That's a point to note actually on this build. I didn't really have a set plan. I had some ideas in my head about how it was going to go together, but when I came to each kind of stage I had to think, how is this going to carry on working? So bear that in mind as I'm doing this build. You know, I did experiment and play, so you might see some bits that just disappear on the builds. I pulled them off and I forget to necessarily talk about them, but that's kind of the fun of scratch building, and the fun of scratch building for Necromunda in particular. You don't need to be super neat and detailed. What I would say though is try and keep all the messy parts underneath. So if you're going to make a mess or use a bit of dodgy sprue, do it underneath the build so it doesn't particularly stand out. Now when it came to gluing these panels together, there were some inevitable gaps because I wasn't super accurate. Now if you were more accurate cutting, you wouldn't have these gaps. You could leave them. I decided not to, so I dug out the trusty pot of goopy kind of sprue goo that I do. This is a technique that I've done probably since I was about 8 years old. My dad showed me this when I built my first Tamiya model kit, so about 30 years ago. All this is bits of sprue melted into a glue pot. You have to use the glass Tamiya pots. I mean, I'm sure there's others you could do, but I've just been in the habit for years. So just filling that in, and because you're filling it in with actual plastic, when it sets and dries, it really doesn't stand out whatsoever. So just one technique. I will do a separate video on how to make this and do it, some more hints and tips later on, so keep an eye on the channel if you want to see a little bit onto there. But that's just how I've filled that gap, because I do keep getting asked how I fill gaps in models. Normally I just sort of skim over it, but that gives you a little bit more insight. Now building up this section, I was testing the wheels onto this base and decided I needed a bit more to bolster it up. Now I'd already built the oil drums that come with the kit, unfortunately, because this would be easier to do if you hadn't already built it. Because I just scored around the oil drum and then sliced it with a pair of clippers into kind of 2 pieces, although I had to give up the middle section of that oil drum. Now the oil drums are perfectly sized to stick to the bottom of these kind of circular areas on the panel, and this is just really to build the structure of holding the wheels together. So I thought initially the little circles would be big enough on their own, but they needed a bit of bolstering, and that's the point, experimentation. Now here you can see, going through at super speed, this is me experimenting with different sort of offshoots of plastic and how I'm going to glue them together. I wanted initially to build like a subframe on the axles that you can see here to try and support the top panel, but I kept messing. I kept kind of working out how to prop it up so it'd dry properly and get the angles, and decided it wasn't going to work and I needed to come up with a totally different way of doing it. And this is what I came up with. So I still kept it supported on the little crates to keep it to the right height. And these are just little balls of green stuff and milli put mixed together. And I actually thought, you know what, I'm just going to seal the axles straight to the bottom panel. I could have done it with bits of sprue and things, but it was taking too long and honestly getting me a bit frustrated, so I thought I'd do it this way. So I put them on, pushed it all down so the green stuff balls kind of stuck it to the top panel, and then really played and pushed from underneath and kind of sealed them in to those barrels that supported. You can see here me messing with a bit of green stuff and milli put again. I'm just really pushing this down into the sides where those barrels are and kind of using the green stuff and milli put to stick it all together. I did put a bit of glue in there as well, but really the green stuff and milli put, as long as you're not going to want to build on it straight away, because it does need time to set, it will set rock solid and actually provide a really strong bond, but also hold it while it is drying. So that's just how I came across that problem and how I decided to solve it. But obviously I'm sure there's other ways you could do it. And as he's flicking back, you've already seen the cast up part, but this is just referencing how I made them when we talk about them in a second. So I made a mould of blue stuff, which is a little product from Green Stuff World. I do have a video on that, and again I'll drop links down below if you want to check that one out. I'm going to do another one though, because that video was about a year old and probably I've learned some new technique kind of since then. But I moulded up the pieces and cast them. Now obviously if you were going to do this build, you'd have to do this before you build the actual trailer or the ridge hauler, because otherwise these pieces are sealed on. Now I just used the back section of the kind of mudguard. The mudguards come in 3 pieces on the actual hauler, which I'm sure you've seen. I just chose to cast up the back one because initially I was only going to use 1 on the trailer, but in the end, as you'll see, I used 2 on each side. So these are now cast up in a mixture of green stuff and milli put. And now it's really fitting them onto this kind of side trailer. So I kind of looked and thought, do I directly glue them on? How do I kind of do it? Decided I need to put a little bit of support on there, because putting them just together I don't necessarily think would work. Putting 1 on as well I didn't think would fit to the theme of the trailer. It was a bit too small. So because I'd done, by this point, I'd made a couple of castings from the same mould. I then cut them down, left the kind of mudguard on 1, and then the others just cut them down into the actual rectangle so we could piece them together. I think that'll work quite nicely. Now once I've got them sort of prepped, I wanted to make like a bit of a support to hold up these guards onto the trailer, because I didn't want to just glue the guards straight to the side of the trailer and leave it flush. I wanted it raised slightly. I wanted this to look like a slightly lowered kind of load bed. Obviously you've seen what the final model looks like with the tarpaulins on, and we'll get to that in a minute, but I wanted it to almost represent that this looked like a piece of equipment that had been covered by a tarpaulin, so that when the monsters or the other gangs attack, this tarpaulin gets thrown off and it turns out it's a weapon. It's not kind of something being transported. So I wanted it to look like a lowered kind of stock bed, or you know, call it transport bed. So I really played around with how I was going to make that support. Now the pieces I'm looking at here and you're looking at is from the centre of this flat bed that we've done, that we cut the 2 sides off. So there's a real ideal width ridge kind of in there, you can see, and I'm just cutting the end off, and that ridge slots on very nicely onto the kind of flat bed of the piece. So just ideal, really complete coincidence that we managed to do that. But again, the joy of experimentation and the joy of never throwing something away. Keep hold of it until you absolutely know you don't need it. Now the trailers in the real kits are obviously towed by that kind of link pin, and there's a particular piece. I wasn't going to cast that piece up and drop it in, but this here is a support strut that goes from the axle to the load bed when you build the actual trailer or the ridge hauler. Now when you put the cab on the ridge hauler, you end up with 2 of these spare, so you don't need them to support the load bed because there's different pieces on there. Absolutely ideal. It's got a nice little socket in the end, and so just really gluing that in to place there. Now you'll see I'm using super glue even though it's on a plastic kit, because I'm dropping in some of the milli put and green stuff in there, and super glue reacts quite well with it and it will set it nicely hard. Does give off quite a few fumes and things though, so always do this kind of stuff in a well ventilated room. I mean, you should do anyway, because obviously any of the glue you use for models isn't particularly nice. So just sealing that in place to then be that kind of linchpin. And all I'm doing before I let it dry is just checking that it's in the right location. And that's another key thing when you're kit bashing. Always keep checking your work as you go, because obviously you're making it up as you go along, but you're doing to kind of experiment. Now I've stuck together the side panels and mudguards like we talked about, the 2 individual pieces. So I stuck those together. Now it's really getting them onto the kit. You'll see the 2 supports on each side that I've made from those in between pieces. bit of super glue, and I'm gluing it on. Now I was really pleased at this point actually that the two supports I've made along with the super glue just held this mudguard really well, so really pleased with that. I thought I might have to do a little bit more messing about to get it to kind of stick and seal, but no, it went on quite nicely. And then it's just really about filling in the gaps and making sure it's definitely not going to fall off, which we'll get to later once the kind of super glue's dried a little bit. Now this is the harpoon weapon off the knight model, the Knight Valiant. I think it is the larger knight that I bought, converted up from a Nurgle army, and deliberately didn't use the harpoon arm. I made a nice tentacle arm for it, and that was a conscious choice. Built it as normal. The only thing I've done differently, as you saw there, is the end cap with the skull on. I put that on upside down so that the skull was kind of, you know, rotated properly, because this weapon is meant to be hung off something, not stood up. Glued it down onto that little circular area, and then really just tested with some pieces from the kit as to what I was then going to glue onto the back of this trailer. Now obviously the super glue's dried on the side supports, and I think it would have been absolutely fine, but I wanted to fill some of the gaps. Now there's a different way of filling gaps on models. This is pure milliput, just mixed up and really just pushed into those gaps and cracks that you've left in between there to make it look a bit more or a bit less ramshackle. Did a bit underneath. Now if you do leave a few gaps, that's fine. If you don't do this section, it's fine. Just the more you leave and skip, the more ramshackle it's kind of going to look. Now I've glued all those accessories down, including a cast up little tool kit on the end there, and I wanted to just make sure the fuel drum would look like it was supported on. So I just made a little sausage of green stuff to look like a strap, and then just fix that onto the back. Now you could absolutely just glue the drum on, it'd be fine, but I wanted to make it look a little bit more realistic. Now onto the camo net, or tarpaulin as you would call it. Again, when you look at real life kind of transportation stuff, they quite often cover them in tarps. So that's what I'm making here, just a simple tarpaulin. This is just bandage that I've had knocking around for years. If you've watched my very first video on the channel, I used this bandage on some Star Wars scenery. I think that was my first video. No, it might be my second video actually. So all this is sliced up little bits of the bandage, cut it to the right size, roll it up, make it look like a sort of tarpaulin rolled up, and I've just used some green stuff to look like the straps that's holding it down. Now this has been liberally doused with PVA glue, so it will set fairly solid, and it will also stick it to the vehicle itself. But if you want a bit of extra security, you can just put some super glue down underneath before you put that on. Now we're going to cover up the weapon with a bit of the bandage, and I just cut a bit off to size, roughly test where it's going to go, make sure that I'm happy with the piece, and I can cut it a bit smaller if not needed. So liberally dousing it with PVA, you can see there just on the back of the green stuff packet, and then covering it on the weapon and really just playing until I'm happy with where it's gone. Now what you can use this tarpaulin for is if you've made a mistake in the build and you've got an area where you've not cast it quite properly, or you've not covered a gap, or there's a bit of the model you don't like, you can just cover it with a tarpaulin and hide your sins. Now that's not what I was using it for, but that's just something you can do if you want to. So really just playing until you're happy with how much is being covered, and I wanted this to represent like they're currently throwing the tarpaulin off as the kind of surprise that this convoy that is now being attacked is actually quite thoroughly armed. So that's kind of what I'm trying to go for. Now onto the painting. Sprayed it black, sprayed it with leadbelcher, and now we're just sort of cracking on with the paint scheme. Now when I'm painting this, I'm not being super accurate. I'm using orange because if you've watched my Underhive scenery set, this is what I painted my Underhive train with, and I want it to look like it's the same kind of guild using all of this. So when I'm painting, I'm covering probably 80% of the panel that needs to be orange, and 80% of the toolbox, as you can see there, because we want it to look a bit bashed, a bit rusty. You know, it doesn't want to look pristine because this is running out into the ash wastes and it's being repaired in the Underhive, so it's not going to be exact. Now I'm painting army green across all the tarpaulins and onto the ammo crates that we're just going to paint up from the accessory set to go in the back of the ridgehauler. You could use whatever colour you want, but I just want to keep it the same because it looks a little bit military. Onto the Munitor armour container at super speed. I always think I wish I could paint this fast, it would be amazing. In terms of total paint scheme though, these actual vehicles, it didn't take that long. I'd estimate it was about 12 hours of painting, which isn't actually too bad. A lot of it done very early on a Saturday morning, as I was off work and I still wake up at 5. Now just showing you, if you make a paint mistake, don't worry about it. I'm just putting this in here, but you can see a big blob of red paint that I've dropped onto that spine. Now quite often I'd be tempted to take it off, but I've left it on because when you're painting something that's meant to look a bit rusty or bashed, an area of really thick paint next to an area of no paint actually just makes it look a little bit more realistic and interesting. So don't always correct your mistakes, you know, especially when you're doing something like this. Now quickly just blacking up the tyres, keeping it nice and simple, and then going on to a retributor armour to do all the interesting brass areas. Now I just talked before about sometimes you don't need to correct your mistakes, sometimes you do. So I spread brass onto the red areas, just quickly wipe the colour off, bit of water on the brush, and I'm just taking that off where I've made that mistake, because some mistakes, you wouldn't have brass drifting onto the red there. So you can see obviously where I've put the brass colour in some places. I've done it on some of the harpoons, I've just picked up some detailing across the model, it just makes it a little bit visually different. And then just painting the straps in a nice brown. Now here's the fun bit, a nice dirty sepia wash. The wash I use is a Vallejo wash, mostly because you get lots of it in a pot for a lot cheaper than sort of workshop stuff. And I do use a mix of Games Workshop and Vallejo paints and all sorts, and the whole list will be down in the descriptions. You can have a look at what I've used. A very, very simple colour scheme though, with not a lot of paint really used. I want to keep it quite basic and muted. So that full wash of the entirety of the model. And this is what it dries like. So you could leave it at this and it would be a nice dirty mucky ash waste model, but really now I want to put a little bit more colour on just to make it pop that little bit more. Now this is no rocket science of colour, this is taking all the exact same colours you've used so far and just going back over where you've put it. Now what you're going to do is drop it onto the raised areas, the areas where light would hit, and try and make it so that the wash is in the recesses, and you're painting these colour stages onto the raised areas or the very, very like spiky parts of the cloth like we're seeing here. So even on the cloth, I'm just putting it on the areas where the folds are and the light would hit. So you can see there looks to be about 5 or 6 different colours just on that cloth and that tarpaulin, but it's not, it's just where the different levels of wash have synced in. So I'm just going to work through all the colours and do the same process. You can see I'm probably covering bit more on the red here than I did on the cloth, but just use your judgment. And what you want to do is just have it so that you've got lots of nice tones coming through from the wash. Let the wash do the work for you. Now on the tyres, actually I'm putting very, very little on. All I'm doing is I'm covering up where for some reason I didn't fully cover the metallic undercoat before. So if you leave that metal undercoat showing through, it looks like obviously where the paint has worn off the metal, but that wouldn't happen on a tyre. Going back through the same thing on the container, and that really gives you the painted finished scheme. So I've whacked a quick bit of varnish on, and that's it. That's the model done. Showed all the accessories not on the vehicle, and now just doing a quick fly through. I painted up the cruise with the same colours that we used on the vehicles, and I think this has given a really, really nice effect, and I'm really quite happy with how this third trailer has turned out. So I hope you enjoyed that as well. If you did, well, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. Check me out on Instagram and Facebook, and hopefully I'll see you again on another video. Cheers everybody.